Welcome to Mex Moves, the weekly podcast where Damian Frazier and I, Eduardo Garcia, break down the topics and headlines shaping Mexico's business and financial landscape. Damian, how are you?
Very well, with a bit of a sore throat, but other than that, all good here.
Great. This week we have two interviews. One with Harry Krensky, managing partner of Discovery Americans, one of Mexico's largest private equity funds, to talk about the industry, its opportunities, challenges, etc. And we also have Pam Starr, a professor at University of Southern California and a senior advisor at consulting firm Monarch Global Partners, to talk about her recently published book, The Making of Mexico, where she deals with many topics, but we will focus on how does she view the Mexican business world and what are the impacts of the recent political changes in Mexico and obviously the renegotiation of the USMCA, which is, according to calendar, being reviewed as we speak. In addition to that, Damian and I will look into the World Cup and the controversy surrounding ticket prices. We will also talk about GDP and education and how the two are related and how that is also hurting Mexico's growth and development. A little bit more on stablecoin and a documentary on one of Mexico's most valuable new fintechs, Plata. So, Damian, shall we start with the World Cup?
Sounds a good place. So, Eduardo, I read on your Substack that you went to the opening game. So tell us how the new stadium is, how it compared to the old stadium. Still very much the same from the outside, at least. And what's your view as an economist on the ticket price controversy?
Well, I was very fortunate to go to the opening game. It was very exciting. It's always fun to go to these massive venues, lots of people. The excitement was extraordinary. As you might have seen on my Substack, I was not really impressed by the remodeling of the Azteca Stadium, now called Mexico City Stadium because FIFA does not allow any sponsors to be named, and it was already being rebranded as the Banorte Stadium. But regardless of that, I mean, it's a fantastic place to watch football. It's been 3 times a venue for World Cup games. The changes were not that obvious to me. I think the locker rooms were much more renovated than the exterior or whatever we could see as fans. I mean, yes, there were some new LED lights surrounding the interior places of the stadium, which are very nice, colorful. They are. The stadium now has 2 rather than 1 large screen. But again, I mean, that screen, if you ask me after watching many games from the States, it's tiny. It's not to the standards of US stadiums. I think they could have put something more impressive because it gives you a greater entertainment capacity to look back at the replays on a big screen. They save the size of the screens maybe to have more fans seated there. The section where I sat was quite tiny. I mean, it reminded me of flying on low-cost airlines. You are really stick to one another. There is no leg room to walk out of the aisle to buy your beer or hot dog. When you do, everybody else has to stand up or move to the side or crouch to their seat, and you have to be very balanced because otherwise you might fall to the seats below you. But hey, that's football. It doesn't matter. It's a great experience. I loved it. I just don't think the stadium is up to world standards in comfort and live experience. As for ticketing, well, it's been everybody likes to pay as much as everybody's paying. As JP, our friend, wrote in a column in Bloomberg, it's working because the stadiums are full. People are putting the money out there to go to this event. These events have become massive, very exclusive, even though, like JP says, there are tickets. But when you take into account that this is a world event with crowds from all over the planet flying into Mexico, US, and Canada, it's really an elite who can afford such high prices. And if you don't charge as much as FIFA, then how do you discriminate? I hate to say that, but that's the way the demand and supply of things work. It seems like it's a large, but it's much higher demand for them. So the prices that people are paying, that I paid, not for the, but for other games that I bought, are very high, 3 times apparently on average higher than in the previous World Cup. And that has to do a lot with the purchasing power of America, of the United States, which is a very wealthy nation. But it's proven to be correct in that sense. There is a secondary market and prices had tumbled at the beginning, but now they're going up as the World Cup has started and the games have been very exciting. Even the small countries are putting up fights that nobody anticipated. And so people are getting excited to go to even games like Saudi Arabia and New Zealand or Cabo Verde and Saudi Arabia. So got it right in that sense. What still is a big question mark if it does any manipulation of the supply side of the tickets, or it doesn't. And how does it use that money to promote football around the world? They claim that they pay for schools in Africa and other things, but there are also cases of corruption within FIFA that have been brought up by the US mainly. So there is a lot of still or opaqueness within FIFA that I think needs to be addressed. And maybe governments should get a little bit more involved. I don't know whether they can or not, but it's going to be a controversy from here till the next World Cup, I'm sure.
Yeah, I like what I don't know if you saw it, but Ken Griffin, the hedge fund mogul from Citadel, and Stephen Ross, billionaire who owns the Miami, they bought 1,200 World Cup tickets for South Florida kids, distributed through boys and girls clubs in that part of Florida, and gave them away. Miami, I think, is hosting about 7 matches. So maybe it's the same thing happened in Mexico, but if it did, there was, as far as I know, no publicity. Maybe we should get the billionaires or the multimillionaires to buy tickets and give them away to to Mexico City kids. I mean, Griffin had that fight with Mandani, who had a viral video about Griffin's $238 million Manhattan penthouse to promote his pied à terre tax. So this was a good PR move from Griffin to buy those along with Stephen Ross to buy those tickets. But maybe Mexico should do something similar.
Yeah, that's the way it might go, because otherwise people that are really fans will have a hard time getting into a game, and that's kind of like a little bit dispiriting, if you ask me. I mean, I go to Pumas matches, and they're even not that cheap, but nothing compared to this. And you would like to see some of those real hard-fought fans to be able to witness a World Cup match, which is something extraordinary. I would say it's fantastic, the atmosphere. I mean, this was a Mexico game. It was crowded. It was overcrowded by Mexicans. There were a few South Africans. But I don't know if you watched last night's game between Colombia and Uzbekistan. It was packed with Colombians. Everything was yellow. It must have been a great party. So it's a great party. Maybe the solution will be to increase more teams, more games, increase the supply of tickets. But who knows? It's an industry now, and we cannot forget that. We've talked about it, about how venture capital is coming into the Mexican football league, how it has crowded the Premier League in England and Spain. So it's like a Taylor Swift concert. You have to pay 15,000 pesos to see Taylor Swift. You're gonna pay a little bit like that to see a football match. Not as much, but obviously, in some cases, you might have to do that. That's the way the world is evolving.
So moving on, Eduardo, to GDP, first quarter GDP breakdown, so-called supply and demand, came out. So we already know GDP quarter on quarter declined by 0.6% and was up just by 0.2% year on year. That quarter on quarter is seasonally adjusted. And if we look at the numbers, I thought, for me at least, what was interesting is that private consumption, which had been holding up the Mexican economy for a while, declined by 0.8% quarter on quarter. Fixed investment fell by nearly 2%. But what was unusual, and maybe against the kind of narrative that many people, including perhaps myself, had been managing, was that net exports were actually a drag on growth. So imports, from a GDP perspective, grew faster than exports. In fact, gross exports increased only by 0.8% quarter on quarter, but there was a 2.2% quarter on quarter increase in imports. So while exports look to be a bright spot, once you subtract imports and convert it into pesos, from a GDP perspective, actually the external sector is hurting growth, not contributing to growth, and that's slightly different to some of the numbers that people have been coming up with based on just sort of gross kind of export growth numbers in dollars without looking at the value added of those exports. And I think that probably is explained. A lot of the export growth is coming from AI related infrastructure, but the value added in Mexico is really quite low. So mainly from Taiwan, Mexico's importing a lot of capital goods, adding a little bit of value and then sending it on to the US. But from a GDP perspective, there isn't much of an impact from that. And then the car sector has obviously been a drag. So net, the export sector's not helping Mexico, at least in the first quarter.
Very interesting. I hadn't realized that. We talked, and you mentioned last time we reviewed the export sector, that imports were driving exports. I didn't know that on GDP terms, it was even hurting Mexico's growth prospects.
So looking at the reasons, I was going through a OECD report on Mexico back in February of this year. And they, for me, the OECD has some of the best objective analysis of any country's economy, including Mexico's. They have very good data. And as far as I can tell, free of, most obvious biases. They blame a lot of the stagnant growth from a long-term perspective, not the cyclical issue, on Mexico's educational system. To quote, they say educational quality has remained stagnant in Mexico, well below OECD averages. And there's some data that some people will be familiar with, but I wasn't, at least. Mexico's on the so-called PISA scores, which are those scores that you can compare educational levels between countries that subscribe to PISA. Mexico's maths level was under 400, 395 versus an OECD average of 470. Reading was 415 versus an OECD average of 4 476, science likewise 410 versus an OECD average of 485. 66% of Mexican students were below the minimum competency when it came to maths, and the number for the OECD is 30%. And so maths is, based on this, the science was 53%, were below minimum competency, and reading was 47%. So Mexico on the PISA levels is obviously doing very poorly. And part of the problem, and there's obviously a lot of different reasons for this, is that the educational system has been hijacked to an important degree. And I repeat, part of the problem is this, by the unions. There are different unions. And in fact, those of us that are living in Mexico City are suffering right now. And as many people will know, from the more radical union, the CNTE, they've blocked the central square for some time now. They've also tried to block access to some of the World Cup games. Eduardo managed to get through, and they are basically looking for the abolishment of merit-based teacher appointments, going back to a system that used to exist before the Peña Nieto reform, where the unions, for the most part, chose who became a teacher, and in some cases, in many cases, teacher appointments were inherited, and in other cases, you had people collecting salaries as teachers that weren't actually teaching, weren't even going to schools. So the prognosis for the future doesn't look too good based on what's happening right now, because the government is making, and has been making, since AMLO really came into power, quite a lot of concessions. They continue to make concessions. Doesn't seem to be helping Mexico City very much. But going back to the OECD, their sort of point is that as we talked about last week, as Mexico's demographic boom is easing, so the working population is no longer growing that rapidly, Mexico needs to have a productivity boom to offset that, and that's not happening. And one of the reasons that's not happening is that there isn't Mexico's human capital. Its trained workers aren't up to the task on average of filling the jobs that that the world economy needs. And unfortunately, even though they put it in very kind of OECD diplomatic language, the direction of change in the educational system doesn't make one very optimistic that that's going to change in the short to medium term.
It's a tragedy, Damian. I mean, it's been a problem for decades. There was a reform trying to change that. Maybe the reform was not communicated properly to the teachers. What I think the problem lies on is the fact that the teachers and their unions have become an electoral machine for the party in power, be it the Morena government right now, the PRI back in the days, or even the PAN, when the union leader, El Bester Gordillo, was very close to Felipe Calderon. And so the core element that teachers should care about regarding educating kids, giving them the tools to prosper in life and be able to find jobs, being put second or third on their priority list. And the most important thing is, how do they exercise power through electoral votes? It's a tragedy, and it's disgusting that Mexico has not been able to solve that issue. I think there are a lot of teachers out there who would like to be able to gain the tools to teach better, to be more pedagogically agile, and so on and so forth. But the union plays a really strong hand on them. They have to go to rallies, do these things, teach this way, and so on and so forth, that it has put in peril Mexico's progress for the future. And it might even hinder the capacity to bring in more investment, because the workers are not up to par as they should be if they were given the tools to perform in a higher level. So it's a problem that's been going on for years, and I don't see any solution. It's gotten worse, I think, with Morena, because Morena pandered to those instincts of political and electoral elements that the teacher union plays for their own benefit, but not for the kids' benefits.
Yeah, I mean, there's two other things that struck me reading about it. One is the impact on social mobility, which Obviously, education is probably the best way of helping people who are born in poor households rise to middle or high income households, and vice versa if education isn't working well. So according to the Centro de Estudios Enrique Iglesias, 8 in 10 people born in the poorest households in Mexico remain in the lowest income quintile, the lowest 20% as adults. And only 2% of those people in the poorest households reach the top. So education effectively, according to this study, is not compensating for inequality of origin. If you're born poor and there's a poor educational system, the chances are you're going to stay poor. And the other thing, and I haven't been able to independently verify this, but I was reading an article by Sergio Sarmiento in Reforma. As we know, he comes from the right, but that doesn't in any way undermine the arguments that he makes necessarily. But teachers in Mexico, he was quoting Mario Delgado, the education minister, make about 20,000 pesos a month, which is more than double the average income in Mexico. And teachers in Spain make roughly the average income. So relative to average incomes, teachers, according to Sogman, aren't especially poorly paid compared to countries like Spain. So the main problem, according to this analysis at least, is not pay per se, although obviously teachers deserve to be paid more than they are paid, but more about how incentives are set so that the best teachers are the ones that get the best promotion, the best professional growth, and that there are national exams which don't really exist in Mexico to give people incentives to give students incentives to work hard and know that work will lead to better jobs and better income for them and their families.
Yeah, that's the key. The incentives, the capacity to prosper as a teacher, with the union and the mentality that we're all in this together and that no one is different than others. It just destroys the capabilities of very good teachers to move ahead and do better. And we have the technology now to be taking advantage, telecommunications and AI, to really help kids learn faster, better, quicker. But the union is a big stumbling block. And not just the union, our political system has created unions of this sort that are very disruptive for the future of the Mexican economy and for the future of Mexico's prosperity.
So let's move on to financial technology. As you know, Eduardo, one of my favorite subjects. 3 different items caught my attention. One, the Bank of Mexico, Banxico, introduced new limits on higher limits on digital bank accounts. So you can now open a digital bank account and have a deposit as much as 135,000 pesos a month without giving your tax ID. Only about 30,000 of that 135,000 can be cash. The rest have to be digital payments. But the idea is to get people into the banking system and not use the fiscalization threat to deter people from joining the banking system. So there's clearly a tension between taxing everyone, which government has to do, pay for better education, among other things, and digitalizing the financial system, because the best way to avoid tax is to use cash. So they're making the digital banking system more flexible and not using it explicitly, at least, or in the short term at least, as a means to fiscalize everyone who is currently outside the banking system, because this is very much focused on small businesses. So I think it's an encouraging development, and this is long been kind of rumored, and now it's been officially promulgated in the Diario Oficial. And secondly, on the same day, the Bank of Mexico put out kind of rules to simplify and homogenize the process of digitally transferring money from one bank account to another. So a lot of banks have put in place knowingly or not, overly complex ways of transferring money. And then most of them have very different ways of doing it, which adds to friction and therefore adds to the complication of transferring money from A to B. And now the Bank of Mexico is saying, these are the steps that you have to take. They need to be very similar across the banking system. So people get used to doing it with one bank, they could do it for another. So they're really trying to encourage digitalization. I think both these measures are to be warmly welcomed. I think maybe they should have happened some time ago, but better late than never.
Without a doubt, Mexico is doing what it should. Maybe it's a bit, it's never late. Glad that it's happening. Let's see how the public reacts. I wonder if that has not been fiscalized for tax purposes. Would people trust that measure? We're very skeptics, Mexicans, of anything the authorities do. So we'll have to wait and see whether the proposals do catch on with the public and that the public feels confident that they're not being looked over their backs for tax purposes. But it's the right move at the right time. And hopefully both measures will help reduce the use of cash in the economy and bring more people into the digital world.
And then secondly, Eduardo, related to financial technology, I was invited to a Stablecoin Conference in Mexico City during the week on Monday and Tuesday. It was pretty amazing. There were a couple of thousand people at the conference. It was in the World Trade Center. Every known kind of crypto company, stablecoin company, regulators, financial fintechs, traditional banks seem to be represented by someone. There were speeches over the course of 2 days, panels, lots of kind of side meetings between people who are using stablecoins to transfer money, especially from one country to another. Bitso is probably who organized and sponsored the conference, along with some others, is probably the leader in that. And in public comments, they've said that 10% of remittances go through their stablecoin for the most part and through their exchange. You had the chief White House advisor on digital assets, Patrick Witt, talking about how governments in Latin America, in Mexico, need to get with it and start to regulate, as the US has done, in a more orderly way, stable coins, which are a much more efficient way than sending money across borders than the traditional kind of mechanism through bank correspondence and using the SWIFT protocols. I use stable coins to transfer money, and it works brilliantly. Matter of seconds, costs $3-4 in some cases versus maybe $50 using correspondent banks. And basically, as I think most people know, stable coins are digital. It's a digital coin that's backed 1-to-1 with a hard currency like the dollar, most famously, but also now Bitso has issued its own peso stable coin. And using blockchain technology, you can move money around in a pretty seamless way. I think the Bank of Mexico, back to them again, has been very, very conservative and reluctant to support legislation. There was some legislation sent a month or so ago to Congress to basically mimic the U.S. legislation, the Genius Act and now the Clarity Act, to ensure that the issuers of stablecoins follow certain practices so that there isn't, or reduce the chances of fraud, basically require them to have treasury bills backing up the stablecoin, so that it's a real stablecoin, which hasn't always been the case in the past. But the Bank of Mexico has been very reluctant to allow traditional banks to go into the crypto blockchain world, even when you're using crypto not to speculate, but as a more efficient and more reliable financial plumbing than the current system. So in Mexico, you effectively have the traditional banks, and then you have the non-traditional banks. But using different technology. Now, whether the Bank of Mexico likes it or not, the sense is that those two worlds are converging, certainly in the US. So you have, companies like Coinbase, which just announced this week, I think, that it's going to be offering kind of standard brokerage products, banking products. In Mexico, Bitso has said the same. They're offering the option to buy and sell stocks and bonds. And now you're getting the traditional banks, to the extent they're allowed to by the regulator, using digital assets to improve their financial technology and tokenizing deposits and so on. So I think in the conference, they called it hi-fi, which is the sort of hybrid between decentralized finance and traditional finance. Regulators, at least in Mexico, are, I think, a bit slow in embracing and accepting this as a reality that the market is coming to. I think eventually it will happen. It's almost impossible to go against what happens in the US when it comes to financial regulation. And if the US, through Genius Act and Clarity Act, if it gets passed, which Patrick Witt put it as the 50-50 chance in the conference, Mexico at some point is going to have to follow in the US wake.
The key element here, I think, Damian, is it's stable coins more than cryptocurrency, right? I mean, the fact that this financial asset is backed by, you said, the dollar, the peso, treasuries, or whatever other asset, I think that should give confidence to the authorities that it's a much more sensible use of a new technology than just a speculative asset. I mean, at least this type of stable coins have something behind them that supports their value. Maybe that was the key needed for the Mexican authorities to be less worried. So we'll have to wait.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Bitso put out a report saying that 40% of crypto purchases in 2025 were stable coins, surpassing Bitcoin, which is the largest kind of pure crypto digital asset. So stable coins collectively are bigger than Bitso, and that was a while ago. So I think if you look at the data today, it's going to be even more pronounced. And then Bitso also said that 60% of its B2B clients were banks or traditional financial institutions last year. So basically, as I said, the traditional entities are embracing it because it's a more efficient way to transfer money, and the crypto companies will clearly continue to offer what I might call pure crypto assets like Bitcoin or Ethereum and Tether and so on, but the stable coins are becoming bigger and bigger and more relevant, and they're either just to hedge the foreign currency risk if you think that the peso is overvalued or volatile or whatever it is. You might just park your money in a USD stable coin, but also it's because it's an efficient way to move money around. And that's what you're seeing, and you saw in this conference. I think one of the things that struck me is just how many of these companies are doing exactly the same thing. So there must have been like 40, stablecoin companies all promising to send your money from A to B at a lower price than the other one. So I think there might be some shakeout due at some point, because I couldn't really work out why we needed so many companies to do something that was becoming a commodity. Consolidation will happen, no doubt about it. Yeah, you're right. How are they making money, basically? And just to finish, from my side, on the financial technology side, I watched yesterday for a sort of corporate documentary, a really brilliant documentary on Plata Card, which we've had on the show. So I wanted to mention it. Plata Card is the fintech that's now Mexico's 53rd bank that has started off issuing credit cards as a non-bank financial intermediary. It's just been approved as a bank. And it's a story of how, hundreds of Russians led by Tinkoff himself left Russia after the Ukrainian invasion, and many of them moved to Mexico. They had worked in the most successful fintech in Russia, Tinkoff Bank, and set up Plata Card. Tinkoff and his partners put in $250 million of their own money. And what makes the documentary really interesting is this sort of combination of hundreds of Russians sitting here in Polanco, hundreds of Mexicans working with them, the cultural differences between the Russians and the Mexicans, but all of them united by this goal of becoming a very successful financial technology company, finally getting their banking license, finally getting valued at 4 billion. Well, in the documentary, they said 5 billion. So they've added another billion since the last press release I saw. And the sense of migrants being forced out of their country because of the Ukrainian invasion, and Tinkoff criticized the invasion and had to leave and basically sell his bank, which has been rebranded T-Bank. There was quite a funny moment. There was a Russian comedian at one of their sort of corporate events who said, let's hope that Mexico doesn't invade Guatemala and Plata will have to be called P-Bank when it gets taken over after we criticize it. But it was quite moving. It also, I think, for people who haven't worked in a startup, and I haven't, you get a sense of this sort of manic energy that requires to set up something from scratch and turn it into a large and successful entity. It's clearly, I imagine, paid for by Plata or supported by Plata. You're not going to find anything critical or negative about it. But notwithstanding that, it's good. It's very good quality documentary. Andrei Loshak, I think, is the name of the director. So recommend that for those who want to see how a Russian-Mexican startup became a multi-billion-dollar company. There's a love story in the middle of it. A Russian falls in love with a Mexican and who he meets in Korea, and that seems to end happily. I mean, the climax is them getting a banking license. Now there are 53 banks in Mexico. Probably 25 of them don't make any money. So I think it's really the middle of the story, or not even the middle of the story. Now the real test is, will they be able to offer?
Where did you watch it? And where can we watch it?
On YouTube.
On YouTube. And then what's the title of the documentary? Is it called just Plata?
It's in Russian. It's the writing. So okay. I mean, obviously, I had the subtitles on, but I think it's called "Payoff for Taking Risk." Okay. So it would be the translation, I think. But the subtitles work great. You have a lot of Mexicans all speaking fluent English, and they're subtitled into Russian. It's for the Russian market. But
I'll certainly watch it.
Shall we move to our interviews?
Let's do that.
Well, it's a real treat to have with us today Harry Krensky. Harry is the founder and managing partner of the growth equity fund Discovery Americas. Discovery Americas is primarily focused on the Mexican market and the Mexico North American market, as we'll hear shortly. It's been around for 20 years, so it makes it one of the longest standing private equity funds in Mexico. It was a founding investor in Volaris, which was a very successful stake for them. They've also been invested in Tracción. They're in the leasing business with Arrenda Plus. They're in the education business with Merited. They've basically been investing in, for the most part, mid-market Mexican companies geared to positive demographic trends, nearshoring trends, and the emerging kind of middle class in Mexico. So, Harry, with that introduction, first of all, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Damian, for having me.
So maybe you could tell us, since you've been doing it for 20 years, longer than almost anyone, why do you think private equity focused on Mexico is an exciting asset class?
Damian, there's an expression in Spanish that doesn't translate to English. It's a word called complicado, and it has negative connotations many times. But for us, it creates opportunities. And Mexico has a unique opportunity set that's very hard to extract. But if you're able to sort of crack the code, you can generate outsized returns for your investors. And in our case, we like to try to leave Mexico a little bit better off by disrupting some old industries. So it's really a place where the inefficiencies allow us to make a lot of money for our investors.
how do you go about that? I guess if it's complicado, it means that you have some kind of secret sauce that other people don't have that is able to unlock that value. If I was going to start my own private equity fund, God forbid, tomorrow, what would you advise me to do, or what would you advise Harry Krensky 20 years ago to do now that you have the benefit of all this experience?
The unfortunate part, there's not a clear recipe book for Mexico. So if you take the US private equity recipe book that's worked out pretty well, it's you buy a company, you lever it up with debt, you wait for multiples to expand, you do a little bit of work, and you sell it. It's just a factory that works very well. None of those things are available in Mexico. You don't have good sources of leverage. You certainly don't have multiple expansion, and you have to be an operator. So for us, the special sauce is a couple of things. The first and probably most important thing is at the end of the day, we don't think of ourselves as investors. We think of ourselves as entrepreneurs and operators. And what we try to do is look for opportunities by, call it working hard. We can get an edge over other people. So our core playbook is roll-ups. We like to buy little companies that have things not exactly formalized and structured and institutionalized, and go and institutionalize those businesses. So that's a very important part of our strategy. The other important part of the strategy is to focus on sectors where we have operating experience. So for us, that means healthcare, education, transportation, financial services, and logistics. And if you look at the composition of the team, we have a lot of operating partners as part of the leadership of the firm, people that have run companies, which I think is very important in Mexico. The other thing that we do, we try to be thematic investors. So for us, when we started Discovery Americas, we believed two things were going to happen. One, that Mexico was going to converge with the US. And that's more or less happened with some bumps along the way. And the other is that what happened in the post-war baby boom to the middle class in the United States was going to replicate in Mexico. So we looked at the same industries in the 60s and 70s in the US when people had more money. What did they spend their money on? They went out and bought better healthcare, better education. They got on a plane for the first time and took vacations to places like Disney World or Disneyland. They went out and paid for food, which they didn't in the past, fast food and quick service food, and they entered the financial services market. So that's another important part of guiding us to try to take advantage of these opportunities.
So if we make it more concrete, why don't we talk, if you're able to, about an example, maybe Mary Ted, the education rollout. Roll up. How did you come across that opportunity? What did you do to roll up the sector, and any other developments that you're able to share?
Sure. So as I mentioned, we start with a thematic and top-down view. So using the example I was just talking about, what do people middle class want to spend money on? Education is one of those places that people, once they get money, they want to spend more money on. And the complicado part of Mexico is the government, I would say, has had a mixed ability to service that market. So we start with the top-down view. We surveyed the entire market. We made sure the macro theme was correct and the demographics were supporting it and the opportunity set was there. We went out and mapped every single private school in the country and said, what is the criteria that we had? We put a very clear criteria for what we wanted in schools, and we went out and contacted the entire market. Now, some of the people didn't pick up the phone and some of the people weren't interested, but we went through the entire market and said, let's start buying individual schools. We believe that we could institutionalize them and extract synergies from those schools by putting them together on a professionally managed platform. Now, when we started, we didn't have a big operation. So one of our partners, Andres Fabre, became the first CEO, and another member of the team was the first CFO. So we basically ran the business from the discovery offices for a period of time until we started doing acquisitions. As we grew, we brought in a professional management team. Emilio Malpica from Laureate, one of the senior people at Laureate, we hired him and a professional CFO to run that business. We grew that business through acquisitions to 7 campuses, fixed up the schools, came with a unified message on how to do best practices and all of the aspects of it, and made a very strong platform that was operating very, very well. We ultimately sold that last week to a European private equity firm that's going to use our management team, our platform, to grow it throughout Latin America. And in it, we generated super high returns for our investors, almost 20% IRR, made 3.5 times our cash on cash return. And in a fund that has 6 investments, from this single investment, we gave back to our investors half of the entire fund from this one investment. So it worked out really well for our investors, who are the Afores and other institutional investors. But more importantly, we were able to do something, bring professional quality of the education of the highest level to the middle class segment in Mexico.
Congratulations. I mean, what do you say to people who have a sort of negative view of private equity going into education, and that they are only focused on the profit motive and not on the kind of well-being of the children or the goals of higher learning?
So you see in the United States, private equity has become a sort of a bad industry or a bad reputation because of a focus on a bottom line. In all of the businesses that we've focused on, providing a quality service at the highest level is our goal in almost every company. So look, there's lots of ways to make money. There's lots of ways to run businesses. We found it successful for us to focus on quality. And maybe you're not making as much money if you're trying in the short term, if you're trying to squeeze every last penny out of an investment. But I would say in the medium and long term, providing quality products benefits you financially. I think if we would have offered a product that was an inferior product, we would not have sold this business to one of the top private equity firms. I think they would have preferred something like ours that's better built than something that's focused on a lower quality product. And, we talk about mission at Discovery. For us, we get a lot of pride from having stuff that stands after we leave and succeeds in the long term. And for us, that makes us feel better, but also energizes our efforts in the space.
And what are they going to do with it? Are they going to fold it into to their own kind of global roll-up of schools?
No, they're using it. Yeah, they're using it as a platform. They're going to take it as is, and they're expanding through, I believe, 3 other countries in Latin America and Central America, and including expanding in Mexico. But the management team that we put in place is going to run the entire platform. So it's not being rolled in, it's being used as the base and the foundation for their future growth. And I think that attests not only to the management team we have, but the quality of the platform that is merited.
Now, some people say, with some justification, that there's been insufficient exits, especially in growth equity in Mexico, and that makes it a less attractive place to put your money. And you referred to the US being a kind of conveyor belt of investments and exits, and Mexico is everything but a conveyor belt right now, at least. Why do you agree with that? And if you do, why do you think exits, with some notable exceptions like the one you just mentioned, have been such a challenge?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things. First of all, at the very first offsite 22 years ago, I handed out to everybody on the team from a hardware store a plastic sign that says exit. And the reason I handed it out to everyone was looking at this, dollar plastic sign. Why am I wasting my money on these things? I said, whenever you're in a building or a private equity investment, you need to know where the exit is. And if you don't, you're going to burn up when the fire comes. When we look at investments, the first thing we look at is who are we going to sell this to? And what we found out in 20 plus years is some of the exit mechanisms that people come to rely on in other markets or have relied on unsuccessfully in Mexico are not good exit markets. We try to design businesses for strategic acquirers. They might be international, and now there's also domestic strategic acquirers. And that's the most stable form, most reliable form of exits. The public markets in Mexico, we've exited a couple of investments through the public markets, are extremely unreliable. The public markets are not robust, and there doesn't seem to be anyone taking stewardship of those markets going forward and putting the money in the development of those markets. So that's a problem for exits in Mexico, that you don't have that market and you don't have financial buyers. In our case, if we build things world class, you can have international financial buyers, but there's very few financial buyers in Mexico. So if you look at the US, IPOs are a very important source of exits. Financial buyers are an extremely important, I don't know the exact numbers, but I think it's close to half of all deals go from one private equity fund to another private equity fund. And so you have to be very careful about what you acquire to make sure that it's easy to exit. And then finally, a focus on excellence. If someone's going to buy one school system or one airline or one trucking company, you better make sure that you're a leader in the space. And for us, that becomes very important. But I think the criticism is fair. Look, selling is hard. I think Merited in some ways supports the approach that we're taking in a market where there is very few exits. We're able to exit. This is not a great time for exits in Mexico. This is a much better time to be buying companies. Valuations are very attractive. People are not that interested. There's not a lot of competition for transactions, but you have to sell these businesses. So if you take a strategic approach to the exit and are focused on it from day one, you're going to be able to be more successful in exits.
And what lessons do you draw from the mistakes or the failures that you've had in this 20-year period?
I think when we look at our portfolio, it's somewhat unique. I think in the US, the mortality rate of private equity funds is somewhere around 15%. We've had what I would call one bad investment in the history of Discovery. And that was in the real estate space. In low-cost housing, we were a mezzanine lender, helping developers create low-cost housing. We lost almost all the money in that space. And we could look and say, look, every developer of low-cost housing in Mexico in 2007, 2008, 2009 went bankrupt. There was this small global crisis next door in the US based on real estate. However, we take a lot of lessons from it. I don't think that that's a fair assessment. It would be the easy way to slough it off as a global thing and a Mexico thing. We went into a space in that case where we didn't know the business well enough. We did not have operating experience in real estate. We haven't made that mistake again. We went in and very early on in that process, we brought in an international investor at a 2x multiple of where we went in, and we became a little bit overconfident. We took that money and we expanded the mandate. So we were initially focused very clearly on a plan to do vertical low-cost housing in major metropolitan areas, and we deviated from that plan. And we paid a price for not understanding the industry well enough, deviating from plan, and we've corrected since then. The other thing that it's a lesson that we've learned that we didn't have to pay a high price. I think Colin Powell had the Pottery Barn rule. You break it, you fix it, and you own it. And at Discovery, when we break things, we go in and fix them, and we go into the fire. So even if you look at our most successful investments, every single one of them has had dark hours where it's very easy to run away from that opportunity, and we embrace it. We don't like it, but we embrace it. And the people that got us into that investment take ownership of fixing it through the dark times. And I think that's a lesson that we've learned where we've avoided negative outcomes in a number of instances that other players, we don't get the sense, do the same thing. I mentioned at the beginning the case of a real estate company. That company, we had lots of financing, and it would have been very easy for us to hand the keys to the lenders. And we said, look, we don't want to have a zero. We went to the lenders and said, we want to return money to our investors. You have two options. One, we'll give you the keys and we'll help you do whatever you want to do, and it's all yours. Or let us restructure everything and give us some money back. And we negotiated a payout to our investors. It wasn't very much, but it was a positive return instead of a bankruptcy. We restructured over 20 loans. We went through every project that we had and fixed it. And we were able to recoup some of our investment because of that, whereas other people probably would have handed the keys. So those are the main lessons that we've learned and sort of the mistakes that we've made over the years, some of our own making, and some of them because of the environment that we were operating in.
Now, some of the most successful private equity investments around the world have been in technology. Your four kind of focus areas are generally not sort of considered technological, although obviously, like every company, they have an important technological element. Is that because you think Mexico can't compete with the global tech titans? It's better to focus on narrow verticals which are more localized in their added value?
So I'd answer that question two ways. The first thing is we are not technology operators, and we don't have the expertise, we believe, to do well in those industries. We don't understand it well enough to deploy capital there. That being said, if you ask the CEO of Volaris, Enrique Beltranena, what industry he's in, he will tell you he's in a technology business that happens to fly planes. And Volaris happens to be one of the most technologically sophisticated airlines in the entire world. So we are users of technology. We have to understand technology on how best to use it and to make sure we're ahead of other people on cyber, on marketing, on AI. And we spend lots of time using AI in our companies and making sure that we're not going to be disrupted by AI. And then finally, I would say, I don't see the opportunity set the same as other people in Mexico for technology-backed companies. I think with the advent of AI and other advances in the field, the barriers that Mexico had historically to force international players to partner with local players is less so than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And I find it hard long term for people to compete with Amazon, with Uber, with Google. And certainly there are niches that make a lot of sense, but it's not as wide of a playing field as I see. And even within Latin America, if I compare Mexico to a place like Brazil, I think Brazil has some competitive advantages over Mexico as well.
Harry, if we move to Mexico, North America, US convergence, I mean, this been a big part of your investment thesis. You've been a big believer in your sort of public speeches and your writings on how Mexico and the US will benefit from converging, and therefore, they will converge. Has being an American, investing mostly in Mexico, living most of your time in the United States, has what has occurred since Trump was elected led you to rethink in any way your thesis?
I would say the policies of the US, first of all, disappoint me. They confound me a little bit, and I worry about them for the entire world. So, not just about Mexico, but for every country in the world. And in some ways, Mexico has benefited on a relative basis, not on an absolute basis, from its positioning against other places in the world. That being said, the convergence is happening. I would say we're having bumps along the way. I think having a mercantilist approach by the US and a tariff regime that attacks the world is not that great. Again, Mexico has some benefits in that situation, and the friction between the US and China benefits Mexico tremendously as nearshoring becomes a truth, regardless of what is being said. And I would offer up as Exhibit A and Exhibit B for nearshoring. I would offer up the external accounts of Mexico. I would offer up the peso's appreciation in recent years. And despite, I would say, an unfriendly investment environment in Mexico as a product of both the policies of the Mexican government and the US government's policies towards Mexico that negatively impact it, we're still seeing investment. So, USMCA, it's June 3rd right now, so it's past June 1st. So apparently we're not going to have it by June 1st. When I was in Washington a month ago, involved in some of these discussions at one of the think tanks, it became very clear to me USMCA is going to be delayed. It's going to be watered down, and there's a very high possibility that it's going to be an annual review. That being said, as you see the US politics evolving, it's very likely we're going to have a different president in 2.5 years with the new electoral cycle. And I think there's a real opportunity to accelerate after we see that. Certainly, it's harder to do this convergence during despite the fact that it's happening, it's at a slower pace than it would be otherwise, in my opinion, if you had better policymakers in the US and a better relationship between Mexico and the US.
You mentioned some investor unfriendly policies in Mexico itself, separate to what's going on in the US. Do you see the situation under the relatively new president, under Sheinbaum, improving? What more would you like to see to become more positive on investing in Mexico?
I would say for me, I don't understand how SAT works, and I wish after 25 years, I understood better. I think that there could be more transparency and a better working relationship with the companies that pay their taxes on time and on a regular basis. And I see that causes lots of challenges. I think I mentioned earlier, the public markets are in disrepair in Mexico. My co-founder at Discovery Americas, Carlos Mendoza, used to run Nafinsa, and his job in the 90s was actually to fix the ecosystem and to use money from the Mexican government to develop the private markets, the public markets, to help companies list. And I don't see the desire to put as much money into the markets as the playbook is there. It just needs money, and it needs support not just from the government, but by the pension system. Really needs to support. If they want vibrant public markets, they need to do something. That being said, the government is making good steps. Fundo de Fundos is finally getting funded with additional resources to help the private markets. And I'm hopeful that there's a catalyst in Finsa, Banco Mext, and Fundo de Fundos to help develop those markets. I would also say, I heard Chris Landau speak when I was in Washington in a small group, and he had some suggestions, let's call it the polite way, suggestions for the Mexican government on how to work together. And look, I'm the first to say the U.S. is not a very nice partner right now, and they're very rough in their processes. But I think Mexico trying to work as best they can on a better relationship with the U.S. and not to focus friction from unnecessary things for Mexico. So if Mexico needs something really badly, certainly they need to follow their own policies. But if something's not important, I see friction between the two countries. And I think that could improve dramatically the investment environment in Mexico.
Harry, final question. For the most part, Discovery Americas is managing foreign money, not exclusively, but it's a big part of the money you manage. Have the Afores been, over this 20-year period, good partners? Do you think they understand private equity? What more would you like from the Afores?
So first, look, Discovery Americas would not exist today without the support of the key Afores in Mexico, and they've been incredible partners. I would say they have been disappointed by the private equity industry. In the early stages, they took a very diversified approach, and they owned the entire market, the good and the bad. And I don't think that served them well. I think going forward, they're going to need to pick their partners on a more selective basis. I think they're doing that. I think the most sophisticated Afores are doing that already. And so I think it's incumbent upon the private equity industry to generate returns in excess of the public markets and to regain some of the trust that was lost from the period of time when every private equity fund was getting money. Now, the industry's contracted dramatically, and so there's been a Darwinian winnowing out process. The other thing I would say, and it's not about the private markets per se, but the public markets really need some support and tender loving care, and we need an ecosystem. And I think the Afores may or may not be the response for leadership in that area, but certainly if the government were to show up with a plan, I think participation by the Afores would help not just the public markets, but with a vibrant ecosystem, private equity do very well. So they've been great partners. We're working together for great opportunities in the future, and I see us moving in a really good place.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Harry. It's a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks so much, Damian. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to welcome Pam Starr to Mex Moves. How are you, Pam?
I'm great. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for joining. Pam has recently published a very interesting book about Mexico called The Making of Mexico, Revolution, Reform, and Transformation, which gives me a great opportunity to talk with her about her perspective on this country. Currently, Pam is a professor at the University of Southern California and a senior advisor at the consulting firm Monarch Global Strategies. She was previously a senior Latin American analyst at the Eurasia Group, where she led the Mexico practice. And prior to that, she was a professor at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, the ITAM, here in Mexico City. Pam has written numerous articles, book chapters, and policy reports on Mexico and its relation with the United States. She has advised the U.S. State Department, including the embassy in Mexico, as well as senior politicians on both sides of the border at the highest level. Pam, let me just start. In your book, you describe what seems to be two long-standing understandings that have shaped the U.S.-Mexico relationship. First, that disputes should be managed discreetly, away from public confrontation. And second, that issues such as trade, migration, security, or whatever it's on the agenda should be handled separately rather than linked together. President Trump appears to have obviously challenged both assumptions, especially during this second term, by publicly airing disagreements and bundling multiple issues into a single negotiating framework. In your view, and in that sense, has the relationship fundamentally changed? And do you see these changes as temporary, or they represent a more permanent shift in the way the two countries will deal with each other after the Trump era?
Yeah, to answer that question, let me take a step back, because one of the things I point out in the book is not only that you have these two unwritten rules of U.S.-Mexico relations, where you have each issue in its own silo, and that disputes are dealt with quietly behind closed doors. But there was also a broader agreement, which I call the Autonomy Within Limits Agreement, in which the United States granted Mexico enormous autonomy in its domestic and foreign policy, as long as Mexico remained a loyal ally of the United States on issues that the United States considered to be of its national security. This agreement dates to the 1920s. It's almost 100 years old now. And early on, this national security meant being on the U.S. side in World War II, on the U.S. side in the Cold War. But at the end of the 20th century, it began to mutate, began to also incorporate things like migration and drug trafficking. The United States never called those things national security issues until the second Trump administration, but they were beginning to become more constraining on Mexico's domestic policy and foreign policy autonomy. So all of those three things, actually, Mexico was able to manage, even in the first Trump administration with López Obrador, but also pretty much during the Biden administration. Mexico was able to ensure that it had a lot of policy autonomy. That changed as well under Trump. So the way I like to think about the relationship is we're in uncharted waters. It's not so much that there's a fundamental change in the relationship, because the fundamental characteristics of the relationship haven't changed. It's still an emerging market economy sitting on the border with a great power. So you still have that enormous power asymmetry, which generates a bit of arrogance on the side of the United States and an enormous amount of mistrust on the Mexican side. And so that's consistent. But we have seen a change in what the United States considers its national security, and therefore how and to what extent Mexico matters to the United States. And it's also, there's been a change in the perception on the U.S. side of the extent to which we have shared interests. And that combination, that Mexico matters more and differently, but in ways in which the United States thinks we don't have shared interests, when in fact we actually do, is the uncharted water part. And so for Mexico, it's very hard to figure out how to respond to the United States, because it's a very different world for Mexico. And it, to a certain extent, is unique to Trump. But even at the end of the Trump administration, if we were returned to the way things were from the U.S. perspective, it wouldn't be back to the way things were. People have already talked about this with regard to Europe, but Mexico has lost its trust in the United States and its willingness to embrace the United States. Mexico really embraced the United States, particularly under President Calderón from 2006 to 2012, but also to a certain extent under President Peña Nieto until from 2012 to 2018. That's not going to happen again in the near term, because Mexico simply doesn't trust the United States.
Quite interesting. So, and when you say uncharted territories, that means that probably the new administration with López Obrador, now Claudia more than López Obrador, hadn't realized that migration and drugs probably had become such an entrenched national security issue in the United States that would demand a different response from Mexico. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes and no. I think both López Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum thought that they could manage Trump in the second administration the way they managed him in the first administration. So they were able to cooperate on migration and security, and that kept him from pushing Mexico to do more and interfering more broadly in Mexican internal affairs. What they didn't see is that Trump 1 was a Trump constrained by advisors who saw it as their mission to constrain Trump's natural tendencies. Trump 2 doesn't have those limits. He's completely unchained. And neither of them, I think, saw that. And as a result, both have been surprised by the way Trump has treated Mexico.
Okay. And so how does, since we're a business and economic podcast, how does that affect the prospects for the future of the USMCA and North American economic integration?
I think it has an important impact, but not as important as some people are suggesting. Because when the Trump administration started, obviously it started out with the IEEPA tariffs on Mexico and Canada. So 25% tariff on the two countries until and unless they began cooperating more aggressively on migration and security. Since the U.S. Supreme Court declared those tariffs unconstitutional, Trump doesn't have that tool in his quiver anymore. So he doesn't have the ability to just say, we are going to put tariffs on Mexico to constrain Mexico on migration and security. So his ability to mix issues has reduced significantly. Now, that doesn't say that the broader security environment is not going to impact the USMCA negotiations. But from watching the negotiations, I'm not seeing a lot of influence or the security concerns entering into the USMCA conversation. There's one area it does enter, and that's in the discussion about between the United States and Mexico about the non-tariff barriers that the United States was demanding that Mexico deal with before we got into the formal review of the USMCA. And one of those barriers was organized crime's involvement in fisheries and other areas of the Mexican economy, leading to an unfair comparative advantage for the Mexican exporters. So it's there. But to the extent that we really are seeing security matters shaping the USMCA negotiation, that I'm not really seeing.
That's, I guess, good news for those that want the free trade agreement to be renewed. It's unlikely that it will happen soon, but that the negotiations lead to some sort of an agreement in the future.
Yeah, and I might add actually that in the security relationship, what we're seeing, what I've seen in the last couple of weeks is the United States coming to terms with the fact that it has an extraordinarily good security relationship with Mexico. In the wake of President Sheinbaum on May 21st, and I'm sure most of your listeners know, May 31st, excuse me, gave a speech in which she drew a red line for the U.S.-Mexico relationship in a very nationalist way, which is we're not extraditing elected officials to the United States. You would have expected the United States to have responded to that, since the United States has indicted elected officials and has announced its plan to do more. And the response was extraordinarily muted. Just the opposite. A number of figures in the administration came out to say that the cooperation with Mexico is great. And whereas previously they always coupled that with, but they need to do more, that didn't happen in the last 2 weeks. And in fact, the U.S. drug czar, Sarah Carter, in an interview over the weekend, flat out said that the U.S.-Mexico collaboration has never, ever been this good. Very much in a Trumpian way of saying it.
So yeah, that to me is also an interpretation that they are keeping what you said on what you say on your book about keeping certain issues separate from each other, even though they were mixed. The judicial ruling by the Supreme Court made it probably a little bit harder to tangle them.
Exactly. And in fact, the point I'm trying to make here is that even if there is influence, the security relationship really is doing quite well. So even if it does influence it, I think it could influence it in a positive way, in an optimistic scenario.
All right. Let me move on to the judicial reform that was approved during the first months of the López Obrador administration, and that has generated certain concerns among investors, be it locally or internationally, mainly because they seem to have downgraded Mexico's rule of law, not that it was extremely high up there. It has also created legal uncertainty and lack of checks and balances. Do you think President Sheinbaum fully appreciates the economic consequence of that reform, and what can her government do to rebuild confidence?
I think she fully appreciates it. There were lots of rumors, and my sense of how she's operated since suggests that they were true. Rumors at the time the judicial reform was being negotiated that she did not favor it, precisely because of the impact it could have on the private sector. But also, in the last week of May, she pushed through Congress a revision of the judicial reform, whose core purpose is to make elected judges more prepared for their position, making sure that they have the credentials and the experience they need to be judges, but also to rein in a little bit the Supreme Court, which is, because it's lost most of its independence and seems, at least looking at its rulings, it tends to rule in favor of the government all the time, reducing the reach of Supreme Court rulings by requiring the court to have a 2/3 majority to declare any law unconstitutional, as opposed to just a simple majority. She did that, I think, precisely because of complaints from the private sector about the lack of confidence in the judiciary and in the new judges. So when we get the second round of judicial elections in 2028, they did also postpone the election 1 year. Hopefully there'll be higher quality judges that will give greater confidence to the private sector. That said, there's not much else she can do. This is a López Obrador reform. She is completely loyal to López Obrador, always has been, but she also leads a movement for which he is the cement that holds it together. And so to turn against one of his primary victories from his perspective, I don't think is feasible for her to do, even if she were to want to do it.
She would need to convince him, I guess, privately that this is not working.
And that seems unlikely given how stubborn he is, or how stubborn he's reported to be. I say that like I know him.
No. We all have that impression, Pam. He is quite stubborn. I've been in press conference and he doesn't change his positions by an inch. Moving on the energy sector, that seems to offer a clear opportunity for Sheinbaum to signal a more pragmatic approach toward private investment in Mexico. Do you agree? And if so, what specific changes would investors be looking for? Could energy become the test case for the Sheinbaum government?
Yeah, I think electricity in particular, I'm going to separate electricity and petrochemicals. Electricity in particular, I think, does offer an opportunity for her to signal to the private sector that she is more pragmatic than López Obrador. I mean, she has signaled that in multiple ways, not the least of which is completely terminating the anti-business rhetoric that López Obrador had. And instead, she has very much a pro-business rhetoric and is very open to negotiating with the private sector. So my understanding is particularly the foreign investors, but even to an important extent, the large Mexican investors have confidence in her and like her, and to a certain extent, trust her. And the electricity sector is the point at which she's making the most important changes that is reinforcing that level of confidence that the private sector has developed in her. And we can do it in that sector because, first of all, she absolutely has to. If she wants to attract investment in particularly nearshoring in northern Mexico, she needs electricity, of which there is a shortage. So she must do that. But secondly, she can, because of the way López Obrador interpreted his own reform of the electricity sector. His division is, as we know, 46% for the private sector and 54% for the public sector. But he also made sure that when he left the presidency, the private sector wasn't producing its 46%. And that had to do with how he interpreted what was public and what was private. But regardless of that, it gave Sheinbaum room for maneuver. She can bring in private investment more than López Obrador did because there's some flexibility there. So she can act in that sector, and she is acting in that sector, and that is sending a good signal. But there are two limitations to energy being the area where she can signal the private sector. One is petroleum. She's got almost no room for maneuver there. She's doing the best she can to try to make Pemex a less bad company, but it's a disaster. And López Obrador has defined private investment so strictly there that there simply isn't a lot of room for flexibility. That said, we are still seeing flexibility. She's negotiating, or Pemex is negotiating with Petrobras for investment, not private investment, because it's a public sector company. So she's still trying to work in that space.
You jump-started my next question, which was Pemex, but
Yeah.
and you said it's a disaster. I couldn't agree more. But the reality is riding heavily on the public finances. I mean, they've been spending billions of dollars on this company. The companies continue to have industrial accidents, oil spills. Olmeca refinery is underperforming, gets flooded. Could there be a reckoning that Sheinbaum again maybe goes to him and say, "Hey, man, this is not helping me. It's not helping us as a movement"?
It's possible, but I don't see it in the next year or two.
Okay.
And then it may be too late for Sheinbaum to get anything significant done. And the reason I say I don't see it the next year or two, the reason I say it's possible is because you can very clearly see she knows there's a problem there, which I'm not sure López Obrador understood. She gets that there's a problem. She's trying to help the company deal with its debt, trying to help the company deal with investment, trying to bring in joint ventures that can give the company more technology. It's not working very well, but she clearly understands that there is a problem. So that's the good sign. But over the weekend, she made an interesting statement, which suggests to me that she's not willing yet to make that next step of allowing significant private involvement in the petroleum sector. She said over the weekend that the energy is essential to energy sovereignty, but also to national sovereignty. And if you're going to equate energy sovereignty to national sovereignty, there isn't a lot of room for conversation about what we can do to allow the private sector more involvement in in the petroleum sector.
That's an area that worries me because I see all the money going to that company with that.
One more thing, you said something very interesting about the fiscal side of it and the question of the Pemex's importance to the fiscal situation. Sheinbaum absolutely needs, as I think everybody knows at this point, she has to have growth for the fourth transformation to work. If there's no investment, there's no growth. If there's no growth, there's no fiscal revenues to pay for the social programs. And without the social programs, there's no fourth transformation. I would also add that she needs fiscal revenues to help pay for her security policies. She's underwater on both public support for her security policy and her economic policy. So she needs to focus on those two things. But it's more than just that. She needs to attract investment. And foreign investors are fairly bullish on Mexico. They're sort of looking for the opportunity, waiting for the economy to grow. But Mexican investors are not. And I would argue the reason they're not willing to invest in Mexico is a lack of confidence. And that derives from something economists call the commitment problem. Sheinbaum is fairly well trusted by the big boys in the economy, the foreigners and the Mexican billionaires. But other investors don't trust her. And what they absolutely don't trust is her strength within Morena to ensure that her successor will be more like her than like López Obrador. And so it's hard to invest over the long term, even the medium term, if you don't know what's coming next.
And there's no signs of that, or that she will be able to appoint her own chosen one, to put it in the old terms. Well, Pam, on that note, I really recommend our listeners to buy your book, The Making of Mexico. We will have you back to analyze probably that presidential succession, or any other topics that might be of great interest for our listeners. So thank you very, very much, Pam, for your time.
No, thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to a second conversation in the future.
Fantastic.
Well, thank you very much for joining Mex Moves. I hope very much you join us next week.